Very good. We are just about to go live on YouTube, Mark. Here we are again for a very special episode of Uplink, which is, I guess it's happening on a pretty special day. Tell us about May the 4th.
Well, first thing, I actually just realized first thing this morning that this is the first anniversary after having a big bike crash. So I didn't realize that I'd actually crashed off my bike a year ago on such an auspicious day, May the 4th, which leads to the alliteration, May the 4th be with you. And of course, it's Star Wars Day today. I don't think, if I understand it, doesn't have any particular resonance in terms of the date of release of anything in the Star Wars. What are we up to now? Nonology, not trilogy, but 9 films. But of course, May the 4th, perfectly good day to celebrate being a Star Wars fan.
It's a perfectly good day indeed. And, I've got to tell you, I can't think of a more defining feature in my life because I've been a lifelong fan. And, given who we have joining us today, I think we're going to be asking some pretty big questions because I have a feeling there are a lot of people in the world of space exploration that can probably say that too.
Yeah, definitely. For me, first Star Wars film came out in 1977. I was already 16. I actually remember that the first moment I ever saw anything about it, and it was in a music magazine with this sort of picture of what we now know as an X-Wing fighter. To me, at that point, it was a tiny little picture, but it looked like an enormous spaceship. So I think everybody went out to see it as soon as it came to the UK, either later that year or early 1978. I can't remember now. And now I go with my kids to see them. So we've been to see the premieres of the first day, the first couple of weeks of the last few films together as a family. So we've grown up with it as scientists, many of us. Not everybody is, some people are, Star Trek fans more than Star Wars fans. But I think to deny its influence on what we do in space exploration as individuals, as people, it's definitely there. And we've had, as you know, people dressed up as stormtroopers, including our good friend Matt Taylor at ESTEC Open Days, wandering the halls of the European Space Agency. So it's even, the Empire has infiltrated our corridors at times.
Indeed, it has. Well, it's certainly infiltrated our imaginations as well. And so a little later, we're going to be joined, of course, by the man, or I should say the droid himself, Anthony Daniels, talking about his role, a character that's recurred in all 9 films in the saga. But before then, we're going to be joined by a very special Space Rocks alumnus, Shahrzad Timman. Tell us a little bit about her background, Mark.
So Shahrzad she works where I do at ESTEC in the Netherlands, and she's a PhD student studying robotics, and in particular robotics with respect to human and robotic exploration. So the places like the International Space Station, where of course we have astronauts on board, but we also have robots on board in various different guises. I mean, you can call a computer in some sense a robot performing functions that humans either don't have the time or the capability to do. But we even have a small robot on board called Simon, who is a kind of an anthropomorphic floating ball head that you can interface with and ask questions. A kind of an encyclopedia, but with that, that additional thing of looking like a human, so not just a random computer stuck in the wall. So Shahrzad works on this sort of human-robot interface. Of course, that's a perfect fit to having Tony Daniels on because he is famously the human cyborg relations droid. So it's going to be great hearing from Shahrzad first about the work that she's been doing with respect to the real robots we put into space. And then when Tony comes on, seeing what influence there's been from Star Wars in the things that we do.
Indeed. Well, it's going to be a fascinating and stimulating discussion. And we've got Shahrzad joining us right now. Hello. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Very well.
Yeah.
Well, happy Star Wars Day to you. Your home is fairly appropriately decorated. Certainly. Are you a bit of a Star Wars fan over there?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Very good.
I love the movies. I watch them over and over again. Do movie marathons, so I drag people into movie marathons. So yeah.
So tell me how. I'm curious because I was just talking to Alex about the fact that I was old enough at the time when the first one to come out to watch them in order. Which one did you see first?
Well, I got the advice from my my boss and my PhD supervisor at ESA, Marcus Landgraf. He said, "Well, you have to start at number 4. You go 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, and this was at the time where we didn't have 7, 8, 9. But honestly, if I could add something to that, I would always just go back to 4 and watch 4, because the more you watch these movies, the more you're going to appreciate 4. Because the first time I watched it, I thought, in number 4, you have to still get into the story and explore the characters, and then you're still trying to figure out what happened. So when you go back, after knowing all the story, you kind of appreciate 4 more. So that's why it's one of my favorites.
It's kind of heretical, but there are people who say you should just drop number 1 altogether. But maybe this isn't the day to mention that.
No. But what's interesting though, of course, is I suppose because we live in a Star Wars world now, perhaps it's easy to overlook just the impact that the first Star Wars movie, Episode 4, would have had for so many people, and not just for all of the big flashy things like fast and light travel and all these, but the people and the beings that we encountered, these droid personalities, that far from being robotic, were actually full of personality. I guess, Shahrzad, that's what we really want to talk to you about, of course, because I think what a lot of people don't realize is that robots play a huge part in exploration.
Absolutely. Yeah, they absolutely do, and they have been for so many years. And when I started studying this, I was astonished by the fact that the amount of years we've been sending robotic elements or any type of robots into space, and the fact that they could have they've been when we have the Russian rovers just driving on the surface of the moon, and then if you look at the time frame of that, you're like, wow, how was that even possible? It's really amazing. And if you look at it, all throughout history and now aboard the ISS and the plans that we have for the future, and all space agencies internationally have for the future, it's just amazing to see that growth, and what you can actually, how we can extend our capabilities just by adding robots into the equation.
So, a really simple question: are robots going to take the place of human beings going out into outer space?
No, absolutely not. If people would tell you that they do, I mean, seriously, stop that conversation, because it's absolutely not true. I have all the sources that you want. I can share them with you later. But basically, I mean, you have human spaceflight. Okay, we all know that, and there is robotic spaceflight. But then, honestly, the key to explore, and especially exploration in terms of, when we will take the next step towards the moon, towards Mars, all that stuff, the cooperation or the partnership, if you will, between human and robots, that'll be key. That's essential.
Well, it's interesting to hear you talking about it in that way, because partnership is usually something that you think about between beings, and that's what's so interesting to me. Of course, I think one of the most ambitious and brilliant examples of robotic exploration, would have to be the Rosetta mission, of course, landing on a comet. But what was really apparent to me in the way that that mission was portrayed was that it created kind of like people, like cartoon characters out of the Rosetta probe, out of the Philae lander, which really kind of struck me, because you did feel like there was a little robot like Wally out there that you kind of cared about.
Absolutely. But were you as sad when the whole thing came to an end as I was? Because absolutely.
Well, I should tell a little story there to interject, because I was working with a team that put all that anthropomorphic stuff together, putting the cute eyes on Rosetta and Philae, and we debated long and hard how we would end that, because we had created a kind of an obligation that we had drawn in. I mean, the adults, to some extent, you can play with, but kids, 5-year-olds would watch those cartoons before going to bed at night. And, adults, their parents would say, what a great thing it is that you've done that. But as we landed Philae on the comet, and then Philae, of course, bounced and went into a dark place and effectively went to sleep for several months. That was possible. We could explain that to kids. We could sort of make it clear that, well, maybe he'll come back alive, and and Rosetta was she, and this was kind of an important brother-sister relationship. But you know, and Philae did come back, and so it kind of created a dynamic. But when we had to get to the end, and when it made scientific and engineering sense to put Rosetta down on the surface, people said things like, oh, you must put them together. You must show them together on the surface. They must be in each other's arms. And we chose not to, because we didn't want to misrepresent the reality of landing them in other places. But we struggled. I mean, we spent a lot of time trying to work out how to tell that story, having made an emotional connection without then being too saccharine, but on the other hand, not just, you know, making a joke out. There's another story for another time about an alternate ending to the cartoons that would have absolutely destroyed everybody. But, you know, it would have been funny for about 5 minutes, but we would have had letters written to us for years afterwards if we had gone that way. And the rest of the team didn't want to do it. It's just me. So,
I mean, only the fact that you struggled with this already shows how effective this was. Just to put, you know, a pair of eyes on it, and to really, because people will then, if you tell them like there is this, you know, this lump of machinery on this, you know, body that you've never heard of, the people, or the kids even, they may or may not be interested in that, or, you know, but if you actually do what you did, it just, you know, it attracts everyone. And that's the whole thing. Space exploration is for everyone. And I think you did a great job in showing that.
Well, I think the most important thing in the end was that it wasn't cynical. It wasn't done as a way of connecting in a kind of a branding way, and we didn't care at all. It touched all of us as well. I mean, I failed to give a talk on Rosetta and Philae, not even showing the cartoons, but even thinking about them. I think of them that way now, as human emissaries to a place that we could not have gone, not yet anyway. Maybe in the future we can. So they went on behalf of us. And I think that, you know, that's something you must deal with in your work, is how to get people in a way to sort of relate to the function that is doing on our behalf. But on the other hand, you know, do you ever get too connected to them where you don't put them into danger because you feel that you're your friend, right?
That's a good one, because I mean, the experience that we have until now is basically having, of course, we do ground experiments, right? So I've done in my PhD like a lot of these ground experiments. So that's like days and weeks and months of these things, when we would have, for example, pilot trainees coming in, steering these things, and then we had the rover driving around at STEC, and it would be, you know, one big experimental campaign. But then already at the end of those, you know, at that campaign, you already notice that, hey, I'm not going to see this rover anymore tomorrow. So I literally would go either to the lab and just, you know, just drop by, or like look through the window just to see if he was okay. But of course, for the future, things will be different, because we know what the purpose of this is, you know, of these robotic elements is. So I don't believe, you know, sending it into a shadowed area, knowing that it's risky, etc., won't be a problem, because I don't think that's the mindset with which we go explore space.
Right.
Yeah. That wouldn't be a healthy mindset to go explore space, I think. Yeah.
So just before Alex jumps back in, and you know, we get Tony in 15 minutes or so. Give me a sense of what your daily life, what your daily job has been at ESTEC. You talked there about rovers and driving into shadow places. So we've got the moon coming up, we've got Mars, but there's also this business of controlling robots from space. So the ISS controlling robots on the ground, rather than humans landing on Mars, perhaps we'll actually drive robots around. So give us a bit of a feeling for how that's all going to work out.
Yeah, so basically what I've been doing, so since my master's that I did with Delft University, I actually was studying some of the data sets that we have between ISS and ground. And that's where the whole idea came up, because I never intended to do a PhD, right? But then at some point, you just find out a bit about this amazing topic, like what the interaction between human and robot, who knew it would be such an amazing thing? And then I studied some of these data sets and thought, wow, if I would just add these metrics to it, what would happen? You know, the amount of stuff I could be examining. And that's how we actually set up this, this project. And what I've been actually doing is to kind of study the time delay between, you know, so imagine you have a robot, so a rover on the surface of the moon, right? And then I studied 3 different time delay scenarios. So one would be if I would be on the ground controlling the rover. Obviously, that gives me quite some time delay, like I'm talking a few seconds. Second is, of course, the gateway. We've been hearing about this. Basically, this is a cislunar station, if you will, a very small station compared to ISS, nothing to be compared to ISS. And it's in the vicinity of the moon. So this gives us already like a smaller time delay. Plus, imagine if you have an astronaut on the surface of the moon and the rover being there on the moon too. But then, as you said, there are some places where we would not send our people, but we would send the equipment that we had actually developed for such tasks. So this is actually the scope of the study. So yeah, this time delay has been an important factor. As you mentioned, the schedule of the day, my favorite days, obviously, and the most exhausting ones were the experiment days, because you would have people in. We kind of selected the people based on looking a bit at astronaut selection. So scientists, engineers with special skills, or people who are actually trainee pilots. They would come in, they would steer this thing, and we would have this, quite a long experiment with them, where they would actually simulate this time delay from the locations that I actually just mentioned. So based on that, we have now a data set that I've been, so the past few months has been all about the analysis of this data to figure out, what is the performance of a human controlling from these different locations. So this has been very interesting.
Well, what's also interesting to me is, this is, if we're talking about our personal experiences with space exploration, a lot of people might not realize the actual genesis of space rocks, or at least my involvement in it, of course, was, from a conversation that began as, well, why don't we do a going away party for the Philae lander, because it just kind of, it sort of broke my heart, to kind of think that, it was just going to be floating out in space, not indefinitely, but, it was going to be a long time before it like fell into the sun. And so, and so it's just one of those things where I have to wonder if things like Star Wars are responsible for the way that I think about these robotic emissaries, more than tools, more than scientific instruments, like little people, that we kind of infuse with our hopes, with our curiosities, a little bit about ourselves as well, which is kind of confusing. But I suppose that's the thing about the human psyche is we find it easier to relate with things, that have a pair of eyes. I mean, anyone that watched Castaway with Tom Hanks knows that there's a very relatable volleyball in that film, that you begin to believe, is a person, which is quite an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Indeed. Well, I think this, you struck an interesting, point there, of course, is that as we project ourselves outwards, we have this idea that we are going to go to these places, that we will be standing. But indeed, if you look at the pictures of Mars that rovers and landers have provided, not too dissimilar to Tatooine in the background, albeit just with one sun rather than with two. There, you really can begin to zoom in and feel as if you're there. But when you add in another artifact, a human artifact, even if it doesn't look human, it's that connection of a piece of stuff that we've built, that we've made, and we've sent somewhere. So actually some of the most popular pictures, and we saw it again just recently with Bepi Colombo when it flew past the Earth on the way to Venus and then to Mercury. Some of the most popular pictures are the ones where the spacecraft takes a picture and it's in the shot. And nobody's sort of saying it's got, eyes and a mouth and anything else, but it's us. It's that projection of humankind into space. And I think you're right that the science fiction films that do it, I mean, obviously we're going to talk to C-3PO, who's designed to look like a human, whereas R2-D2, okay, it's got Kenny Baker inside, so it's human size. But then BB-8, as we have now, right? It's just a ball rolling around on the ground, but you can give it character in other ways. It doesn't have to be through how it looks. It can also be through behavior in some sense. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, we've had people working with us who've on the artistic side suggested putting rovers onto Mars in the future, which actually become artists. They actually go around and make rock cairns and signs and things. So I just wonder if the temptation, Shahrzad, sometimes is to actually give them a human gesture, give them a human something, partly because it's us, we're there, but also again, to make it relatable. I don't even know what that would mean for a rover. Have you thought about that at all?
I mean, if I may, the thing, actually, the problem that the phenomena that you see, that we automatically humanize something, it could also be the other way around. So I think, so I'm an engineer, right? And I work with this, on human robotic partnership with my engineer in mind. So it's not my, I love robots, or I love humans, or it's with my engineering mind saying, okay, I have these set of assets which can help me to achieve this goal, and how am I going to do this? So just to give you an example, one of the things that I've been, at some point I started talking about a robotic system and a human system, and at some point my PhD advisor just said, don't do that. You can say human system. That's just wrong. Yeah, but I really mean it, because me with my engineering brain just look at it as a set of systems. But apparently that's not okay. So you can also watch it from the other side and think, okay, but can you kind of look at it, look at a human as an asset, and look at the robot as a human. So I think it goes both ways.
That's because you're an engineer, right?
Yeah.
It's an incredibly a stimulating thing. But I do wonder, again, given the context of where we are, how much Star Wars has to do with the way that we frame these questions and how we think about things. Because growing up, to me, it's always been obvious. It's always been obvious that these are more than things. These are people. And well, we're going to be joined in just a moment, by the man himself. We can actually get his thoughts on what he thinks about it all, certainly. So I'm pretty excited to say this, but yeah, very shortly we're going to be welcoming Anthony Daniels to Uplink. There we are, and there he is. What an absolute pleasure to have you aboard. Are you receiving?
I am receiving, as they say, loud and fairly clear.
Fantastic. Well, I don't think this is the first time that you've heard this today, but on behalf of everyone at Space Rocks, I have to say, happy Star Wars Day. Thank you so much.
Certainly not the first, and it will not be the last. And I bounce it straight back to you. Happy Star Wars Day. And I kind of touched to be part of the wider community today, because we're all in the kind of same boat pretty much. It's not easy. Some have it way worse than us. But I really was happy to be part of this reaching out to each other around the planet, because for heaven's sake, with the media we've got now, well, we're all in each other's pocket. The odd thing for me, of course, is doing a late night show, which is a breakfast show in Australia. That's one of the toughest calls, but always a pleasure to work with my Aussie friends.
Indeed. Well, it is such a pleasure to have you here. But you're absolutely right. Given the current circumstances, the challenge that our entire world is facing, our entire species, they are things like Star Wars that do bring us together and remind us of the community that's been created around these remarkable films, and I guess what you can say, this remarkable culture as well.
It is a cultural phenomenon, and anybody who doesn't think it is, get right. I remember having a bit of well, I told a music critic off once, because he said, because I was doing the show Star Wars in Concert, John Williams, wonderful pieces, played live in huge venues, 25,000 in the audience every night with the symphony orchestra. And we were in a certain city, and he said, well, he was doing an interview. He said, I've been stuck with this interview, so we'd better get on. I'm the classical music correspondent for the such and such paper. I won't name him and I said, do I gather that you don't regard John Williams' music as truly classical? Oh, well, it's meant for a film. I cleaned the guy. I totally cleaned. He made me so mad, because the snobism of classical music, people like that, it's just rubbish. And of course, in the end, he wrote me a wonderful apologetic email and wrote a wonderful article, because music, John Williams music, for instance, brought people, young kids, into not realizing it's classically based and structured, but he gave them a key in. And John Williams music is a key to so many scenes and experiences we have in Star Wars. Because that international phenomenon of music, you don't have to speak languages, it speaks to our souls. And I would like to understand a bit more how that works, but so far I haven't really got there yet. But it is, to go back to your premise, Star Wars is a major part of culture. Back in the day, it was hard to get away from it, and I wanted to get away from it a bit, but it was already everywhere, images, sounds, writings, and now it is just, it's part of our lexicon, our dictionary.
Indeed, please.
Do you have, pleasure to meet you, Tony, by the way. I'll just say that it's not the first time that we've met. Of course, you've met a million people since, but we first met in 1979. So I at a science fiction convention.
Well.
So, exactly. So, and we were talking about this before you came on, about the influence that it's had on astronomers and space scientists and people that are actually doing these things now for real. But I wanted to touch back on this business of the cultural ramifications, because of course Star Wars also provides a sense of identification, a sense of family for some people in a fractured world. You know, you have things like the 501st Legion where people dress up as stormtroopers, but it's not just for fun. They also do charitable works, and they brought people together over many years. And I do wonder whether you sense that in some sense there's almost a responsibility built into this entire phenomenon by now. Have you seen that grow and change in your many years of involvement?
Oh yes, and you make an extremely good point, and it's not one I ever expected to feel I had to subscribe to, but the feeling of responsibility of being in these films. They became more than films, they became more than entertainment. And we all have our likes, our lesser likes, and so on. And it's always been an area of debate and argument and love and affection and joking and creativity. But yes, it is a responsibility to be a part of it. And one thing I've noticed, which I really dislike, is if I say something, if you're in a film, if you're in a Star Wars film as a member of the cast, and you give your opinion, your honest opinion, well, you know, I didn't like that scene there, or I wish there could have been more than that. Suddenly it's headlines. Anthony Daniels blasts Disney Star Wars makers. You know, the press can be tricky. And if you are in this situation, your words can be given far more weight than they deserve, frankly. So to some extent, I don't want to give my opinions because they can be misconstrued. The fact that this franchise has supported me and has supported many other people as well, and entertained beyond millions of crowds around the world, is the important thing. That's really what's brought us here today, on this day that's been designated. And why not, for a bit of fun, just here in my office, just to join in for once.
Indeed. Well, it's certainly stimulated a really interesting conversation just before you joined today as well. Not just the global cultural impact of the films, but also the one that your portrayal of C-3PO has personally had on the way that we think about robots, about the way that we think about our kind of robotic emissaries, which, increasingly organizations like the European Space Agency are sending out into space, because, we don't seem to think of them merely as, tools or instruments that are floating out there, almost as if they're little people. And I can't help but wonder if your portrayal, if the character that you made real is responsible for that at some level.
Well, you really flatter me. I don't think so. It's interesting that really Star Wars is not the home of scientific endeavor. I think Star Trek, I hate to use those words, Star Trek has much more real science in it. Star Wars is more the fantasy side. But yes, okay, you have a robot. And back then, I was reluctant to even be interviewed for the role, because back then I remember the Daleks, which were pretty impressive, frankly. I know it was a sink plunger, but it ran the wrong way. It looked pretty nasty. And Robbie the robot in, what was it called, Lost in Space, I think, you know, kind of whatever. Early days. And then comes 3PO, this humanoid bipedal, highly intelligent and strangely sensitive. And that was one of the things that appealed to me in George's script. And I think, you know, I'm not going to accept the accolade of having turned the whole world onto robotics, far from it. But I think certainly it had an effect on me that as I grew on in this role, I began to look at machines in a different way. I know it sounds odd, but I remember one time having a near nightmare experience in the desert in North Africa. And I got lost in the desert. And this car, this ordinary saloon car, got me and my partner across this desert. It took 8 hours, but I thought we were going to die, you know, boiling heat. When we got to a hotel, she went inside and I kind of turned back and that sounds crazy, but I went back and patted the bonnet of the car and said, thank you.
I mean, just before Shahrzad jumps in, because she actually works with robots and humans on a day-to-day basis, I think, yeah, probably you are underestimating the influence you've had indirectly. We were just talking about the fact that we have anthropomorphized our space robots as a way of connecting. And of course, yeah. C-3PO was designed to be that because he was human cyborg relations, whereas R2-D2 is just a dustbin with legs. We actually have, I don't know if we've borrowed from the culture which surrounds the anthropomorphization of robots to make that connection.
And that is exactly the right word, anthropomorphization, if you could say it, which I can't. It is, and you make a point, human cyborg relations. It is that that connection that we have, and I know many design elements in industry and domestic products and so on do try and make them sometime to a more successful end easy to deal with. You know, there's certain products that are a pleasure to look at and to touch and to feel. And you've only got to look at some of the medical robots that are currently on show and in practice in hospitals in other countries. I think, you know, the big eye thing, okay, they may be cameras, they may be not. But and people have anthropomorphized their pets for millennia, I would imagine. Oh, look at the way my dog is looking at me. He understands every word I say. No, you wish he did, and you live on that connection. And it works because to the dog, you're making nice sounds or cross sounds or whatever. And the dog's big eyes is giving us contact. And one of the things in 3PO's face is, of course, the designer, which was Ralph McQuarrie, and Liz Moore, the sculptor, did make these big eyes that really gazed in a kind of questioning way. And that look in Ralph McQuarrie's original picture was, I think, possibly what, and a terrible little picture here, but it was that face that just stared out. Clearly the man was made of metal, or the thing was made of metal, but it was the face that connected to me because he looked lost. And the same thing happened and we're talking in film terms here, but iRobot, those very, very clever sort of silicon and armature type robots. And I forget the character's name, but he had his eyes and his features really connected with you. And they clearly weren't human, but they had humanity about them.
Then you get to Ex Machina, of course, and that plays us for complete suckers because we're so in love with this human robot that we overestimate that it's like us. And well, if anybody hasn't seen it, it comes to a sticky ending, let's say. So
yeah, and then and it is extraordinary how many film writers can really delve into all this stuff. I'm thinking now of Bicentennial Man with Robin Williams as this thing that eventually makes the transition from a computer android in a box that they assemble and, you know, how may I serve you? And then eventually over the years, he becomes human through the influence of being around humans. It's kind of a weird film, not my favorite, but interesting thoughts. But, you know, one of the things that occurred to me as I was coming up to this program, and I'm sorry, I couldn't tune into your previous talk. Several times I've been on visiting places, MIT or whatever, and certain establishments. And at one point I was talking to the team who were doing the moon landing vehicle, the things that zoom around on the planet. And they wanted, I wanted to talk about that. They wanted to talk about Star Wars, because Star Wars had been their inspiration. And that is one of the magical things about it, that there is a professor, Cynthia Brazil, at MIT, who was, I think, a 7-year-old girl, maybe I shouldn't give her away, I'm sure she's much younger, took to R2-D2 and 3PO in such a way that she already decided at that age to make robots happen on her planet. And she is now a professor of robotics at MIT, particularly to do with sentient robots that can interact with human emotion, whether it's haptically or physical, virtual response or visual response. And she saw Star Wars and the two robots as her inspiration.
Wow, that is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, Shahrzad, are you familiar with those sorts of developments? I mean, that sounds absolutely mind-blowing to me.
I mean, yeah, we have at the lab can I first say it's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Daniels. Yeah, at the lab, we have a human-robot interaction lab at the European Space Agency. Of course, there's a planetary lab where they test rovers, but especially, we have a separated, dedicated lab that focuses on the interaction between human and robot. And I think that's, really great that we focus on this, because there's all kinds of, as Mr. Daniels was naming, but also other technologies like, exoskeletons and whatnot that actually make this interaction happen.
We do, as you speak, it occurs to me that we do crave humanity, going back to anthropomorphism. We somehow as humans, we crave humanity in things around us. Look at that cloud, it's got the face of a whatever, look at the dog, as I said. We do not want to be alone. And the more we rely, we need to rely on machines now, but we do look for something, but also something human in them. But also, here's the thing, if that humanity lets us down, and I'm thinking particularly of an experience I had in Japan with a company who made beautiful silicon hostess, in the best sense of the word, figures that could announce whatever. But they showed footage, unbelievably, of this beautiful creature, and eventually I would work with one, and really captivating look. But people would ask it questions, because that's what its role. And it kept getting the answers wrong, and kept really being, and you could see in the video, the customers getting really, really annoyed, because they'd been promised something that was insultingly failing them. You thought you were a real robot. You're not. You're a real human. You're not a real human at all. So you have to have utter reliability and believability.
It comes to this interesting question about what's called the uncanny valley, where you try to make things so human that you fail at that final hurdle. And so I'm not sure if that's ever really been put on Star Wars, that the robots, I mean, perhaps when the CGI aliens came along in the later films, there was this idea they were trying to be human and didn't quite succeed. But the robots never had that, because they were truly mechanical, albeit with human personality. People didn't sort of say, oh, it's trying to be human. It was C-3PO.
Well, one of the things you remind me of is that as a character, you're not only playing your character, other people are playing the character for you. So if I can explain that to work with Luke Skywalker, Mark Hamill, and to have him as a very handsome young man in perfectly human clothes, totally human figure, for him to relate to C-3PO in a very honest and matter-of-fact way. There was no nothing remarkable. It was an everyday experience. And I believe that helped the audience believe in C-3PO.
Well, obviously, well, it's not just the fact that it's Star Wars Day, Anthony, but you also have a book out, I Am C-3PO, the inside
Yes.
story. So we've spoken so much about, the impact that your portrayal of that beloved character has had on the, not just the scientific world, but also on global culture. But the book is really also about the impact that C-3PO has had on you. I suppose it's a taking stock of not just remarkable career, but I suppose also navigating that incredible impact that these films have had.
It has been an experience that I never thought to have. You know, famously, I never thought to meet George on 1975 on the 14th of November, because I wasn't impressed by robots or science fiction or anything. You know, that was 1975. Sci-fi wasn't a huge thing. I talk in the book, and relating to something we just mentioned about reliability, but I talk about having walked out of the movie in 1968, a long time ago, out of the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. And there you had a robot, HAL, and it was running the space station. And all you saw was a red light, like a studio red light, and a hypnotic voice. I think it was Douglas Rains. His voice was so believable in its calm North American accent, but you believed in that red light and that voice. Red light didn't even go off. I think it went off at the end. But the believability came from the other actors who were marooned, terrifyingly, it turned out. And it was an early example of AI, artificial intelligence, kind of getting it wrong, getting a little crazy. And I think, you know, we should talk about how do you safeguard machine learned machines? You know, how do we stop them taking over? Or is this just terror talk?
I don't think it is. I think, you know, it's something we have to plan in as artificial intelligence grows in power. I think the kinds of machines that we put into space at the moment, that Shahrzad works on, that we build, just, you know, a box which we send somewhere, we call that a robot, even if it has no sort of human features at all. Those are machines which are not designed mostly to be self-motivating or self-initiating, but we do put robots, for example, we will be putting a rover on Mars, which will be autonomous in the sense that it will pick and choose where to drive, because it's so far away from the Earth that we can't drive it in real time. To be more efficient, we let it drive itself. Now, that's still probably 50 years away from true sentience, but I don't know, is it something you've thought about, Shahrzad, that at what point do we put limitations? You know, Asimov's 3 laws, for example, you know, it's a little bit in the future still, is it? But is it something that ever gets discussed at coffee?
I mean, of course, hell is the most terrifying example, right? But I think what we need to realize, you know, today is the fact that, I mean, you mentioned that we will send robots or rover to Mars, and then there's also an American rover or multiple rovers on Mars. But I don't think the general public actually grasp the fact how much of a human input there is still in operating such machinery. So, you know, if we say there's an autonomous rover driving on the red planet, already that sounds a bit scary, because does it make its own decisions? Does it pick, you know, choose where to go to? No. It you know, it runs into an obstacle, and if it has not been programmed to answer the question it's facing, it'll stop, go back and say, Houston, we have a problem, and then basically it'll just wait until it gets feedback. And there's this, you know, large team of people behind the scene actually working on that to actually determine its response to the situation. So I don't think today we're at that level where we should be afraid of, you know, AI taking over the world, but we should be looking at how we can implement technology, you know, developments like this to actually get us where we want to go, you know, to kind of help us in exploration, because yeah, it can be definitely a good way forward.
And what about the potential arguments, or the already nascent arguments about the moral rights of machines? You know, if you're, all right, you're sending them to Mars or the moon or whatever, an alien environment, but now we have robots that will go into Chernobyl or into disaster areas. And we have, you know, if you're having robotic figures that pretend to interact as a human figure. What do you feel about these arguments? There should be a, if you like, a Bill of Rights, another Asimovian law to look after them.
Yeah, so I think the good news here is that these machines are built by engineers, and there are pros and cons to engineers. There are many cons, but one of the pros to us is the fact that we can switch that off, and we can stop looking at a machine, the machine that we put so much money, effort, resource, whatever you can think of. We can just switch that off because we know it has a goal. Because the goal of the machine is what goes first. So I think bringing it, driving it into a dangerous location or performing a risky task that can lead to damage to the system. I think that's something that you prepare for because it's designed to do tasks like that, and it's that's why we make them. But of course, yeah, it goes against what we've been talking about before because it is also a human thing.
Yes, because again, we're using that word anthropomorphism. You know what I mean, the anthro word. I can only say it once a day. Do we begin to care about some of these objects? We all feel bad when we drop our favorite coffee mug and it smashes on the floor. We feel bad for ourselves. But if you have developed a respect or a liking, if you will, for your favorite gadget, do you risk having second thoughts about putting it in danger?
Well, we were talking just before you came on about the Rosetta mission, which you may remember 2014 to 16 was European Space Agency mission that went to a comet and did fantastic science, orbiting around the comet, put the small lander on the surface, and we did anthropomorphize them to the point where we had huge engagement from the public who felt emotional when Philae, the small lander, turned off over 3 days. Its battery went down.
Yeah,
there were grown adults in tears in the control room. It was remarkable.
I remember it very well now. I'd forgotten about it. Absolutely right. I wasn't in tears, but yes. So these guys in the control room, scientists, had made that connection.
Well, no, absolutely. My team put that work together, making cartoons, working with an outside company. But it wasn't only the cartoons that did it with the big, the big doe eyes and so on. It was this idea that these two machines were out there having a kind of a dialogue, exploring together. And the biggest moral dilemma for us, actually, in a sense, I mean, not as scientists or engineers, was what happened at the end of the mission when the decision was made to put the Rosetta probe onto the surface and end the mission. There was the option to leave Rosetta out there, to go out towards Jupiter, turn off for another 3 years, then maybe reactivate coming back, but it may not have turned back on again. So we made the decision to actively, if you like, kill it. Now, that's not the word you would use, deactivate, crash land, but we had a responsibility to the people we had brought into the program who had identified with those robots as being humans. I mean, I was prompted to think of in the Star Wars films when C-3PO, sort of almost as a comedy act, occasionally gets arms ripped off or heads ripped off and all the rest of it. And but it's just a robot. And yet, of course, every time that happened, there was this amazing outpouring.
One time in the third film, episode 6, I was watching the London Symphony Orchestra scoring it at Abbey Road Studios, and it came up on the screen. They had their backs to the screen, and John Williams conducted the bit where 3PO's dismembered body was going into the fiery furnace, having been blown up. Oh, it was Empire Strikes Back, I think. And you saw the head going in a container towards the flames, and they finished the sequence, and then they cut and did a replay. So the orchestra is now watching the screen, and as it came up, they're all, to a man and a woman, oh, I was so touched. They didn't know I was there. You're absolutely right. They had grown fond too.
And to some extent, it's odd because it then, if we create too much of a connection, how do we reasonably behave as engineers? I mean, I think Shahrzad is a lot more cold-blooded perhaps than I am as a scientist in that regard. We put them in danger because they have a function, but if you create too much of a connection, it can be difficult, I think.
I think also what Mr. Daniels was saying earlier, like you expect something, you know, you expect a robot to interact with humans to kind of to be, you know, act a certain way. And I think we see it in episode 9. There's I mean, it's too late for spoilers, right? We're good to
Yes.
Yeah, you're fine.
watch it by now, else they're not fans, right? But I think there was this moment where they had to make a decision they had to get into C-3PO's basically head, let's say, but there was a risk that the memory would be wiped and you wouldn't be able to recognize people and not have the memory. And I think that alone was heartbreaking. You know, I was there in the premiere in Amsterdam and we were sitting there, people were like, no, don't do it.
I'm sorry. I knew when we were filming it, curiously enough, it was a very moving scene. I knew what the outcome was going to be, but sadly, all the nuances didn't quite come through in the film because there was so much to put in the film that some of the kind of little touches were cut out. So there was a much bigger debate whether to take away his memory, and a much bigger doubt on 3PO's part. You know, I really don't want to do this. And so the build-up and the tension was like, oh God, they're going to hurt him. And 3PO said, I don't want to be hurt. And then, of course, he makes this brave decision, which is much more significant because of the build-up. And then it happens. And then in the original, you live for quite a time thinking, oh God, what do they do? And because of the truncated length of the film, the sequence, he's back to normal pretty quickly. So you don't get to suffer. But even on the set, and when I saw it on the trailer, to my surprise, I didn't know it was going to be there, when he says, taking one last look, sir, at my friends. Oh God, I'm getting goosebumps now. It's actually a very clever line because, in my mind, okay, you were talking about Finn and Poe and Rey, who we were friends on the set, and obviously friends or colleagues in the situation in the film. But also, I realized I was saying goodbye to it all, and I realized I was saying goodbye to the fans who made all this happen in the first place. You know, George made a film. People loved it so much, the fans loved it so much, that he made, you know, 8 more. Yeah. So I have existed on the kindness of others, if you like. But here's the thing, which you may want to just think about. Moon vehicles and all that kind of thing, and rescue, whatever. But what if you make sentient, figurative creatures? There's another film called AI, Spielberg's, slightly odd, but again, there's some terrifying things in there. There's a sequence called The Flesh Fair, where they get a bunch of old robots that have some beautiful faces. Maybe they don't have bodies, but they then begin to destroy them by shooting them or throwing acid on them or whatever. And it is horribly, it is very, very unpleasant. It's kind of pogrom that happens in front of your eyes. And it shows the lust people have to destroy machinery, much as the Luddites did, you know, back in the day. Do you think there's ever going to become, from a disestablished workforce, somebody who used to run a spinning jenny, a loom, and then was, or used to run the looms, and then mechanization took over, and they tried to break the machines because they wanted the job? Is there a risk in anything but moon vehicles?
I think, I mean, you immediately reminded me of if you've seen them on YouTube, films by the company Boston Dynamics over recent years have been making humanoid looking robots. Originally, they were powered externally with big cables, but now they have powerful enough batteries that they can effectively do parkour, they can run around. And to show the robustness of the systems, they often, you know, whack them with a baseball bat and knock them to the floor. And they have dogs and other animal analogs without heads. And it's incredibly distressing to watch those films. And of course, those are robot makers making machines that demonstrate that they're robust. But I'll be honest, I really do agree with you. I think that in the next 50 years, as these robots become more and more humanoid and become closer to us, there will be a fraction of society who will resent them maybe, or take perverse pleasure. I mean, after all, people still torture animals, right? Our own pets, people will go out and torture them for the sake of some sick amusement. So I think, yes. And the real question is, do we feel empathy for them? Are they actually human? Is it perfectly okay to whack a box of electronics with a baseball bat?
I occasionally smack my PC to see if I can very, very lightly.
We all have a love-hate relationship with our laptops. Yes.
There are moments where 3PO will smack R2-D2 for being irritating or whatever, and that was something I just that actually came quite naturally.
Yeah.
Because the relationship there, and there I was on the film set relating to a thing that I had to pretend had human qualities, even though it was just a box, it didn't make any sounds. In my head, I had made a relationship that I'm very glad it sort of came across on the set, on the finished film. But I did use my human sensitivity to create that relationship.
Did you, that's interesting because of course, famously Kenny Baker was inside R2-D2 often, but did you project R2-D2 as Kenny, or did you see R2-D2 as completely separate from Kenny?
Oh, totally separate, because generally I wouldn't know if Kenny was in there or not. If there was more shouting, he would be in there because they had to yell what to do. To me, R2 was just this blue thing. And, you know, a lot of them had motors in, or they would be on a piano wire being pulled along, or just there, or maybe there was two of them in a scene because it was too difficult to get them to move. So I had to have kind of a nightmare world. It's something I got used to, but really like improvising with a chair in a drama class to get somebody to believe that the chair is a personality. It's something actors sort of can do sometimes. And, you know, I got so into the ability. It took a few days because nobody had explained that it wasn't going to speak to me. That this, although it's talked in the script about the dialogue, it was one-sided. There was no reaction to my speech. There was nothing for me to bounce off. So I would very quickly get in the habit of learning the whole thing in my head, which, you know, wasn't kind of easy. And then, of course, Ben Burt put on all those sounds. And here's the thing. So 6 months after we'd finished filming, and then, of course, I eventually see the movie, and wow, R2 is speaking to me, and I'm replying. It worked so well. But here's the thing, many people won't know. It is Ben Burt's whistle. I can't whistle. That is Ben Burt whistling, and whistling's a human sound. And then there's kind of sounds, which is actually Ben's son, I think Ben also, as a baby, you know, Ben Burt recorded those gurgle sounds. And by putting them in this mix of an electronic keyboard, I think it's just a 2 or 3 octave keyboard with the electronic sounds, by mixing in those human tones, it gives the R2-D2 unit a humanity beyond belief, really.
That's amazing.
Absolutely amazing, indeed. Well, you know, we're coming up toward you know, the end of our time with Anthony, of course, and I guess I want to bring in some of that community, of course, that's been patiently watching from all over the place, and actually, we've got an interesting question from Armel, who actually worked on the Rosetta mission, you know, for Shah, just kind of asking. Do you think that by making communication between humans and robots more human, e.g. using vocal commands, we're actually limiting the way that we interact with them? I mean, should we be aiming toward anthropomorphism, or should we perhaps be, I guess, a bit more computerized?
But for what sense? For,
I mean, I guess making human, is giving robots human-like qualities actually where we should be striving toward, or should we just sort of, I guess, keep them purely robotic?
there's two things, right? There is, on the one hand, you want to achieve a goal, and that's why you design the robot, and that's why you design it to interact with the robot, train it or whatever to get to that goal. That's, you have to kind of get that focus right. But on the other hand, what we discussed just before at the beginning was the fact that we need to engage the community in this, right? So everyone should know that we're exploring space for them. And that's what's so powerful, I think, about space exploration. Just like Star Wars, it's for everyone. But also, space exploration isn't just for a selected group of people who get to work on it. No, it's actually for everyone. So absolutely, giving it like they did on the Rosetta mission. If it engages people, if it attracts people, if it attracts kids, then of course.
Yeah. I'm suddenly stimulated by the idea that actually maybe C-3PO throughout the films had an internal dialogue running at 100 times the speed of human interaction, and he just had to slow down to interact with these annoying human beings occasionally.
Maybe that's why he's so frustrated and irritated, But as you speak, I'm thinking there's a generational thing here. I'm clearly of a generation that's on its way out, that isn't quite as fluent with even a cell phone, tap, tap, tap. If you see me tapping out a message, it's with one finger. And I pass people in the street and managing not to get killed in the traffic. But there is a community of people who are totally easy with, call it electronics, if you will, who enjoy interacting with a tablet, a thing in their hand. For older people, that's harder. But of course, as a dying section of the community, not too soon, we hope, the community that comes up will be much more educated in the electronic world, if you like, much more accepting. But then, you get into this whole thing of remoteness, of loneliness, of lack of human contact.
Indeed, and we have a very good question from Paul. It's one that's played on my mind as well, Anthony. Will C-3PO's story continue?
At the end of the book, I haven't mentioned my book for a while.
I Am C-3PO, out now from all good publishers.
The inside story, and see, that's what's kind of weird about it. Because I talk a bit about I talk about a kid. I've been, is it hot in the costume? I do wish somebody would ask me a question I'd never been asked before. Well, what would that be? Smart kid, I thought. But then, what will happen to 3PO in the end? I was stunned. Silenced. After his token presence in the last films, I suggested to JJ that he should give 3PO a fitting end, a meaningful end in The Rise of Skywalker. A melting down, perhaps a careless scrapping. In human terms, a death, for the cause. He looked at me. Not on my watch. So 3PO survives, and I meant it, that rather than trail on to rust and decrepitude as a machine, give him some noble task that, yes, he died going into that lake of acid to do whatever. 3PO is too fine a character, whether it's because of me, because of George, because of the beautiful costume made by Liz Moore, because of space magic. 3PO is too good to let go. And I think long after I'm gone, he'll be around. I hope so.
Indeed. Well, I've got to say, on behalf of all Star Wars fans, on behalf of everyone at Space Rocks, Anthony, it has been such an absolute pleasure to have you on. Your book, I Am C-3PO, is of course out now, available via all good booksellers. And I just got to say, if you'll forgive me, also as an audiobook,
audiobook. You can get it on Audible. These eventually will be, there's 1,500 of these in the world. Sadly, they've come out at slightly the wrong time. But you can buy so these are the physical discs, which apparently people don't use so much anymore. But yeah, you can, on Audible, you can download the book and hear me reading about it, including that little extract there.
That has to be the way to hear C-3PO actually narrating your story. If you excuse me for transforming who is who in this whole story.
I get a little confused myself sometimes.
Indeed. And,
so I know what you're going to say, won't you, as we close up?
I'm sorry, but I'm not sure I'll ever get a chance at this. I got to say, may the force be with you. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here.
I've had a blast. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Tony. Hopefully we can see you again in the Space Rocks world elsewhere. We'd love to have you come and do a live
That'd be really
event.
good. I know not every day is Star Wars Day. We'd like it to be, but you know, I have to go and do other stuff.
You're part
Thanks
of
so much for getting me on.
Pleasure. Thank you so
very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, well.
Wow. Sorry, now we can let the breath out. Sorry, I mean, wow, that was fantastic.
What a gosh, a legend, a legend. Shahrzad, have you been breathing for the last 45 minutes? I'm not sure I have.
Oh, the part where he started reading from his book, I was just looking at my screen and I saw you guys were doing like, wow.
Absolutely. Well, I have to say, I think the audiobook is the way to do it, just to do it in that absolutely stunning elocution. I mean, his voice, you know, created the character, you know, his miming, everything else. To do that through a mask is just absolutely stunning. And obviously, I don't think he responds too well to too much flattery, but I really can't believe the scale of impact that his character has likely had, not just on space explorers, but future engineers and well, certainly people like me as well.
Yeah. I mean, look, I mean, as you look at those books, I mean, I think it's even stated in some places, the two main characters throughout the entire 9, it's written around those two robots and that kind of love-hate relationship. And the fact that we link to that, the fact that we associate with that is, of course, partly down to the context that they were in, the sort of fantastic worlds they explored. But it comes down to human beings like Tony, you know, bringing a life force that, you know, that Robbie the robot perhaps didn't have, and others. You know, the fact that they're so symbolic, I think, really speaks to the actor as much as it speaks to everything else.
Indeed, and you know, let it be said, what an incredibly lovely man as well. You know, to be just the part of a saga that's you know, occupied people's imaginations around the world, so many generations, so many families, to get through it all, and still be like that is you know, truly inspirational as well. Not just the character he played, but also the human being behind it all, certainly. So yeah, indeed, it's fun.
Any other questions that may have come up online in the meantime? And we've got, you know, we can take a little bit more time if Shahrzad had time.
Indeed.
I'm kind of, you know, I don't want to let this one end, frankly. I'm on such a high at this point. Let's just keep going.
I'm gonna be smiling for a while yet. Well, actually, well, we have one from is that Matt Taylor? Yes, it is.
Oh, of course.
You know, how close should robots be to humans in appearance? Again, I think this kind of speaks to something else that was said earlier from Armel. Should we stay with the Star Wars format, or should we go with Nexus-style replicants in Blade Runner? I mean, I guess it also speaks to artificial intelligence and the whole Asimov's, you know, laws of robotics. You know, should we ensure that robots stay distinguishable from humans, or should we move toward a time when perhaps they're indistinguishable? I mean, you mentioned Ex Machina, Mark, and of course that's a phenomenal film, because once they begin to look like humans, we begin to expect them to behave like humans as well. I mean, that's pretty deep. Yeah.
Well, look, I think perhaps in the space exploration domain, as Shahrzad said, look, for the time being at least, we hyper design our machines to perform a function, and anything that we might do to anthropomorphize them or humanize them at the moment is an add-on. I mean, I was just sort of motivated to think, as you know, that in space, arguably, you know, maybe we need to modify the humans rather than modify the robots, because, you know, legs, they're pretty pointless in space, right? Let's get rid of those. Arms and heads, maybe, but back on the ground, of course, there is a massive industry around providing robotics, not only in factories, but for human comfort. And we see that in certain countries where people will have robotic pets, they will have robotic humans that they relate to. And Tony spoke to that very eloquently. At what point do we project so much onto those companions that we expect too much from them? I mean, that comes in advance of them later on perhaps turning on us. But, you know, will we be frustrated with those robots? I don't know. I mean, Delft has a bigger robotic program than the work that you were talking about with respect to space, Shahrzad. Are these things where there are actively groups meeting in robotics departments to talk about that future, that we don't get surprised by it, that we deal with it now rather than leaving it?
That's a good one. What I do know, some years back when I was still studying in Delft, we at some point we opened the cyber zoo. And this was at the aerospace engineering faculty. And then the entire faculty and the entire university was so intrigued. Everyone was like, cyber zoo? So is it like a zoo, but then with machines? And I remember the opening with the dean and, you know, I think the whole director of the university and everything. And we had flying machines, crawling machines, hopping machines, you know, driving, all these things. You know, and different levels of autonomy. And it was just great. I mean, it's a very, the topic is very alive. And I'm sure the topic of how will this go in the future and what you mentioned is definitely something to think about. But I think, again, going back, I think especially in exploration, right? Or in space flight, and then especially by, for example, what we would make in ESA or any other national agency or international agency would be mass always goes first, right? So mass is money. So I think if we would have to put a pair of eyes on it and it'll cost us, you know, a few grams more, definitely they would take that off. But in commercial space flight, as you see, for example, now with you know, SpaceX and stuff, they make stuff prettier. So they make stuff prettier because they can afford it. It's not, you know, it's not public money. They can, it's their own money, so they can actually afford to do this stuff. So I think we'll start seeing this. You know, imagine maybe at some point we'll have a rover that's also maybe SpaceX comes up with the rover. Yeah, Elon, please do. And then maybe they will indeed put a pair of eyes or whatever on it to make it, you know, a bit more relatable. I think at this moment in space exploration, yeah, there are these factors that are more important. Yeah. Yeah.
And I've got to ask a very ignorant question, you know, but I guess I've come to the right place, haven't I? I mean, in many ways, you know, people conflate robotics with artificial intelligence, right? But, you know, the two things aren't necessarily interchangeable. I mean, Mark mentioned Boston Dynamics. I mean, a chill immediately went down my spine because obviously if you've watched the videos, yeah, I mean, they're just kind of like these terrifying dog beings, you know, or basically these sort of like, you know, headless humanoids, you know, sort of really awkwardly jumping over things and all that. But, you know, there is something kind of weird about it all and unsettling, you know, and of course, you know, C-3PO is somehow a beloved character, just with a few changes, you know, giving it eyes, you know, giving it a mouth, you know, and as Anthony said, you know, giving it big eyes, you know, so it always looks quizzical and fascinated. But it's really AI. That's the real question, isn't it? I mean, Anthony said something very important, you know, just like at what point, you know, will robots begin to, you know, mechanization begin to kind of replace labor forces and so on. And we're already beginning to anticipate that happening, not with robots, but with AI, because of course we use robots for all kinds of purposes, not just exploration already, but it's really AI perhaps, you know, replacing legal professions, you know, other sorts of things. We seem to be nearing a threshold there where some tasks, some bureaucratic ones, will be fulfilled by the AI. And I mean, well, let's just face it, anyone that knows anything about algorithms and social media knows that, you know, there are all kinds of software programs that seem to dictate our daily lives. So we're certainly in a very interesting time right now, you know, when there's full of possibilities. I'm an optimist. I hope we're moving toward the robotic duo, like, you know, R2 and 3PO, more than a Terminator thing. But I suppose we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, we mentioned it earlier on, Anthony brought it up, you know, that HAL 9000 in 2001 is infinitely more chilling than any anthropomorphic robot, perhaps until we get to Ex Machina, right? The story with the anthropomorphic robots is they were like us. Well, HAL 9000, even though he thinks he's like us, is absolutely not like us. Of course, HAL 9000 was programmed in you can argue, programmed in a way that made him psychotic and incompatible. It was in some sense, it was a lack of human understanding what it was asking HAL to do that made HAL evil, if that's the right word. But yeah, I mean, but there was no other action. It was just an eye. He controlled other parts in the spaceship, of course, and he could move things around. But yes, the actual existence, sounds incredibly Luddite, but I certainly don't have a speaker in the house that I can say, hey, turn this on or turn that on. I have no interest in doing that, frankly. I mean, maybe maybe I'm old. I don't have Alexa or Siri is off on my phone. The whole thing freaks me out. Partly also because I know my data are going somewhere else and being used to train a bigger AI. Now, Shahrzad's smiling at, she said, come on, they're great, right?
No, I'm not saying that, but I just wanted to say nothing in our house happens manual. So everything is automated. And I'm not just talking about the lights or the music volume, but frankly, anything is automated in our house. And we love it because it's something, it's all these possibilities that you get to explore. And, if you can just automate stuff, it's pretty cool. But I just want to go back a little bit to the point that you mentioned about HAL and it just being like this red light, right? So just a question, what do you think would have happened if they had made it into a character? Like with eyes, legs, whatever, but something you could relate to, which we couldn't with HAL, because HAL, from the start, I'm like, I don't trust this thing. And to the end, I'm like, this thing is going to turn evil. And at the end, you just end up resenting this red light. At least for me, it's just a mean thing. But imagine like a character would have been built around it that first helps them and communicates with them and, gives them their daily schedule, etc. And at some point it just senses in their way that he's going to be shut off. And then would we be taking the side of would we feel more empathy for HAL? Yeah. Would we have, been on his side instead of the other side? Something to think about. Because the function would have been the same, but how we project it would have been different.
Yeah, I mean, Hal didn't exactly do a good line in jokes, right? I mean, Hal was, as Tony said, Douglas Rain's voice was very soporifically calming to the point of, not being a friend, not just sort of. I mean, occasionally he would say things. Oh, is that a sketch you've made of such and such? He'd attempt these human interactions, but I think critically fail. And I suspect that was probably written into the filmmaking deliberately to not build that empathy up. But if it had been C-3PO sort of bumbling around and being lovely, and then he turned evil, yeah. I mean, there was, this shows my lack of memory of all of the films now, but there was a time where, did C-3PO become evil at some point? There was a version of C-3PO in one of the films.
Well, I'm not sure how far we are into spoiler territory, but
come on.
But yeah, I mean, I think the Star Wars universe is an incredibly interesting one because there is no question. One of the first questions ever, posed to 3PO, is how many languages do you speak? So clearly, robots are both good and evil. They're instruments of perhaps. They're tenders, they're companions, and so on. They never quite escape the sensation you have that they are servants. That they don't enjoy the same rights. Of course, Star Wars, as Anthony says really well, is not the kind of sci-fi exposition of those issues. It's really kind of in other worlds that's really kind of explored. Things like iRobot, of course. Where
again, Blade Runner is the classic example of that, right?
Like Blade Runner, just at what point do things begin to have rights? At what points do these tools become people? And I guess that's probably a question that we won't be able to answer today, but weirdly we're going to be answering as the years roll on and we move toward this future where robots do become a facet of our everyday lives. I have to say I'm going to have to go and have a really deep breath outside because this has been an absolute thrill. Definitely a May the 4th for the history books, certainly. I've got to say, Mark and Shahrzad, thank you so much for joining. As ever, thank you for bringing your thoughts. And of course, anyone who went to Space Rocks not too long ago in London knows, Shahrzad, that you're already an alumnus of our kind of extended family. We look forward to having you here again as well.
Thank you so much, Alex and Mark. It's a pleasure always to chat with you guys.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. And then we couldn't have a guy who played a seminal character in the world of Star Wars give the Vulcan salute. I think like really the Earth would have cracked in two, but you've got to do Star.
But we can do Space Rocks, right?
There we go. Fantastic.
Yeah, I think Tony probably would have done it, but we'll do it in another universe, right?
I didn't want to rip the space-time continuum apart, but yeah, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to everyone for watching as well. Be well. And
Thank you
we'll
very much.
talk
See you
to
soon.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.